Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne. This is a series where we're taking a look at some of the choices made in the translation of Bloodborne. And to that end, I thought I'd start out today by taking a step back and briefly looking at what I mean when I say we're looking at the translation choices here. So, character limitations are one aspect of this, but there's a bit more to it than that. In a way, this touches on something else that I brought up in the previous episode. Namely, when I was talking about the question of how literal are you going to be. This touches on one of the oldest ideas that is present in translation. The way that I've most often seen this put is that you don't want to translate word for word, but rather sense for sense. The thought is that in an absolutely ideal translation, the translator penetrates to the core of what's being said in one language, and then perfectly reproduces it in the other language, even if the exact words used are not the same. By the way, I have no idea why this attack didn't kill me, but I was happy it didn't. Anyway, back to what I was saying. There is, of course, almost never a situation in which you can exactly accomplish that task. There are a multitude of real-world constraints that can pop up at pretty much any stage in that process. And there are also things like time constraints that can inhibit every stage in that process at once. What this all boils down to is that when you're working on a translation, you end up being forced to make a lot of different choices for different reasons. And seeing what those choices are, as well as how they might impact your understanding, is what I think makes this series so interesting. But enough theorizing for me, let's get back to reading some item descriptions. Molotov cocktail. Explodes in raging flames when thrown against an object, one of the oldest hunter tools available in the workshop. Since the tragedy that struck Old Yarnum, fire has become a staple in beast hunts and is thought to cleanse impurity. Certain types of beasts have an abnormal fear of flame. Of particular note here is the name of the item itself, the Molotov cocktail, but I'll get to that after I've knocked on this door.
Are you that outsider? Well, sorry, but I don't want anything to do with you. Trot along, will ya?
And let's just make sure that's all he has to say.
Are you that outsider? Well, sorry, but I don't want anything to do with you. Trot along, will ya?
So the translation's pretty straightforward for that little bit of dialogue, although I really like the last line. The Japanese might more literally be translated to something like, please just leave. But by having that be presented as, trot along, will ya? It really adds a lot of flavor. That's the kind of extra touch, that little extra note of character that helps build a great atmosphere for this game. But anyway, let's get back to the Molotov cocktail. Apparently, the use of that term, Molotov cocktail, is enough to break some people's sense of immersion with the game. Now, in order to understand that complaint, you have to dive a little bit into the story of how the Molotov cocktail came to be a term at all, because it has an origin that's directly tied in with the Russians and the Finns in World War II. Time for another break, though.
Laziov, come on. He'd open the door on a night of a hunt. Away with you. Now.
And let's do another check for repeated dialogue.
Laziov, come on. He'd open the door on a night of a hunt. Away with you. Now.
I consider this to be another solid and atmospheric translation, but back to the Molotov cocktail again. So, right before the beginning of World War II, Russia and Germany signed a non-aggression pact. This treaty also contained some secret provisions. This included a division of the territories of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and Romania into different spheres of influence for the Germans and the Soviets. This laid the groundwork for the invasion that we're most etymologically concerned with. But first I have another item description to read, so I'll get back to that in just a minute. Bloodstone shard. A solid shard that forms in cold blood. After death, a substance in the blood hardens, and that which does not crystallize is called a bloodstone. At the workshop, these bloodstones are embedded in weapons to fortify them. So I think this is a fairly standard translation for this item, except maybe for the term cold blood. But we'll be getting another item later that will allow us to talk about that. So for now, I'm going to return one last time to the topic of the Molotov cocktail. With the groundwork all set, the Soviets invaded Finland on the 30th of November 1939. This began what is commonly referred to as the Winter War. At the time, the Minister of Foreign Affairs was a man named Vyacheslav Molotov, At one point, he went so far as to claim that the bombs being dropped on Finland weren't bombs at all, but food supplies for starving Finns. As a result, the people on the ground began referring to these bombs as Molotov breadbaskets. Then, after they'd fashioned incendiary devices to counter Russian tanks, they decided to call them Molotov cocktails as a kind of drink to go with the food. So that's my understanding of the story of the Molotov cocktail. It also helps explain why some people have a problem with the term being used in the game. Molotov is the name of a historical person. Not only that, he's a historical person who has nothing to do with the setting or genre of Bloodborne. With all of that having been said, though, I think that there are a number of good reasons to use the translation Molotov cocktail. One argument you can make in favor of that particular translation is entirely visual. So here on the left is an image of the Molotov cocktail used in the game. Now here on the right is an image of a Molotov cocktail that I found online. Pretty similar, as you can see. Since my poor character has just died, though, I'm going to cut a loading screen, and I'll talk to you again in just a few seconds. Alright, back to the point I was making. There's a pretty common conception of what a Molotov cocktail looks like, and the item in the game looks like a Molotov cocktail. That, I think, is a pretty good reason to call it one. But since this series is all about language, let's talk about some more linguistic-based reasons that you might want to translate this as Molotov cocktail. The Japanese for this item is kaenbin, and in a very literal translation, you might render this flame bottle. But this is a real-world term in Japanese, and it's worth considering how exactly it's used. So here's the first page of Google results if you search for kaenbin. Click on that first Wikipedia link and it gets you this. Even if you don't speak Japanese, you should be able to make out the words Molotov cocktail there. Translated, that line would essentially come out to, also referred to as a Molotov cocktail. If you continue to read that Japanese Wikipedia article, you'll find that the term kaenbin is used to refer to a specific set of incendiary devices. Technically, they do not explode. What happens is that the flammable material inside the bottle is released when the glass shatters. This often results in fire spreading out onto whatever this device breaks upon. The point of this technicality, though, is that because it does not explode, it is not classified as a type of bomb. In English, we would distinguish between an explosive and an incendiary device, though in most practical applications, these terms tend to be employed together. So what does all of this information tell us? Well, we know that in regular Japanese, the term kaenbin can also be referred to as a morotofu kakuteru, or Molotov cocktail. Also, alternative translations like firebomb have some points against them as well. After all, Molotov cocktails are not technically bombs. Combine this with the image and the common conception of what a Molotov cocktail is, and I think you have a fairly strong case of being able to use that term. One other nice thing about this particular translation choice is that you can shorten the way that you refer to this item to simply Molotov. This is something that they do take advantage of in the game. Notably, later on, you can get an item called a delayed rope Molotov. This kind of makes me question whether or not character limitations were something that affected the translation as well, but I'm somewhat inclined to doubt that, as the longest item name is 27 characters long, and delayed rope Molotov, for instance, is only 20 characters. But it's still something that you're always going to have to keep in mind when you're working on a translation project like this. Ultimately, I personally have no objection to the use of the term Molotov cocktail. I think that it perfectly gets across the correct idea of what the item is, and the origin of the term doesn't bother me. What you think of it, of course, may be a different story. After all, players can hardly control their initial reactions to translation choices like this. If you're playing a game and you find that a particular term stands out or bothers you, then that's just your reaction. One of the reasons I've spent so much time on this, though, is to demonstrate that sometimes there are good reasons on both sides of a particular translation choice. It also brings up the question of what to do with things like eponyms. Those are words that have entered common usage that were originally proper nouns. This is related to the kind of linguistic change that companies like Kleenex and Band-Aid are somewhat terrified of. They don't want to lose their trademarks if their product happens to become synonymous with a particular item? At what point has a term become so ubiquitous that people start throwing it around without regard to historical authenticity? The term guppy, for instance, is named after a real person and originates in the 1920s. But if you have a visual depiction of one in a fictional setting set earlier than that time, should you use that term to refer to it? It's these kinds of choices, where you have to value one aspect of a word over another, that are a part of why I find translation so fascinating. This problem is also compounded in video games by the fact that you have visual information, though that does make me wonder about the translation process for this game. In my own experience of video game translation up to this point, there haven't been that many times when I've had an opportunity to get a visual of the kind of material that I'm working on. Oh, but speaking of visuals, I do love the image of this burning scourge beast. It sets a tone for the game, serves as a reminder of the 2 times you've seen that enemy type before, anticipates the fact that you're going to be running into them again, and makes you question both your own actions and what's going on exactly here on this night of the hunt. Back to the point I was briefly making before, though. I wonder if the translation team had an opportunity to take a look at the images of the items they were translating descriptions for, because sadly enough, I can easily imagine that not being the case. But I did just pick up an item. Let's take a look at that description. Cold Blood Dew. Droplet of cold blood containing blood echoes. Used to gain blood echoes. Hunters sustained by the dream gain strength from blood echoes. They imbibe the blood with thoughts of reverence, indeed gratitude, for their victims. So there are a couple of interesting things I want to talk about here, but first I'm going to knock on this door.
I don't reckon you're from round here. Well, stuck outside on a night of the hunt. Oh, you poor, poor thing.
So, first things first. Let's talk about cold blood. The term for that in Japanese is shiketsu. Literally, this means death blood. And as far as translation choices go, I feel like this is a good one. Death blood dew or death blood droplet, neither of those sound very good to me. Cold blood, on the other hand, sounds fairly natural, especially after we hear about pale blood. And after all, when does blood turn cold? After you're dead. So there's even something of a sense of the original meaning that gets through. That having been said, when I first played through this game in the English version, I wasn't quite sure what to make of this cold blood stuff. And to be honest, I'm not sure until I played the Japanese version whether or not I could tell you that cold blood was literally the blood of the dead. I think this is a case where they went with a clever and smart translation choice, but ultimately looking at the Japanese has given me a new appreciation for the term. So basically, the various blood items seem to work like this. Something dies, and some of the substances in the blood crystallize into a gem. Others harden into bloodstones, and what's left is the cold blood that we use to get blood echoes. But let's take a look at this new item description. Pungent blood cocktail. Mature blood cocktail that releases a pungent odor when thrown that attracts bloodthirsty beasts. A precious tool in sadly short supply. In Yarnum, they produce more blood than alcohol, as the former is the more intoxicating. And now let me come over here quickly and read this lore note. When the hunt began, the healing church left us, blocking the great bridge to Cathedral Ward, as old Yarnum burned to the ground that moonlit night. Okay, I'm going to start out talking about this note, because there are some interesting choices here, and I'm going to take this line by line. The first one is, when the hunt began, the healing church left us. A more literal translation of the first line in Japanese, though, might be, on the night of the beast hunt, the great bridge leading to the Cathedral Ward was blocked off. So notice that the more literal translation is in the passive tense, meaning that the blocking off of the Great Bridge isn't ascribed directly to any one group. Let's follow that up with the second line, though. A literal translation of that would be, the healing church intends to abandon us. So now we have the introduction of the idea of the healing church abandoning people. At this point, I think it's safe to say that it was a good decision to make the first sentence active. It's simply stylistically more acceptable in Japanese to use a passive sentence. It's just a difference between the languages. So once the actor has been clearly identified in the second line, changing the first sentence makes sense to me. We're not entirely done with the note though. From this point on, I'd like to focus a bit more on the timeline. By the way, while you are safe up here, it's probably wise to not taunt these guys and then immediately run down and engage them both at once. But anyway, let's go back and look at the literal Japanese translation as a whole. On the night of the hunt, the great bridge leading to the cathedral ward was blocked off. The healing church intends to abandon us just like they did on that moonlit night when old Yarnum burned to the ground. And since I just died, I'm going to cut a loading screen. And when we come back, I'm going to read you the official translation again. Okay, the sentence was, when the hunt began, the healing church left us, blocking the great bridge to Cathedral Ward, as old Yarnum burned to the ground that moonlit night. So what I feel ends up happening is the timeline is more vague in the English translation. Particularly with the use of the word as, you might get the sense that this note was written contemporaneously with the burning of old Yarnum. So I'm not sure what ultimately went into making that specific set of translation choices, but I do wish they'd been able to be a little bit clearer about the timeline. But let's go back and talk about the pungent blood cocktail. And the first thing I'd like to talk about in regards to it is the item name. Literally, this would translate to strong-smelling alcohol of blood, which just sounds horrendous. By the way, let me just say that of the times and places to die in this game, right after you've opened a shortcut is a pretty good time for it to happen. Anyway, the pungent blood cocktail item name is remarkable to me in two different ways. First, there's the employment of the word pungent, and just in case anyone's unaware, the relevant definition there would be sharply affecting the organs of taste or smell, as if by a penetrating power, biting, acrid. It also has an old feel to it, which is appropriate since it comes from Latin, and the first recorded use of the term in this sense is from the 1660s. As for the second thing I think was well done about the choice of this item name, is the use of the term blood cocktail. For one thing, it's a succinct and well-worded way to get across the idea that this is an alcohol made with blood. If, for instance, the term were pungent blood liquor, or worse, pungent blood alcohol, it just wouldn't have the same effect. But there's one other aspect of this item name that I really like, and that touches on something that goes beyond just the pungent blood cocktail itself. It draws on the association that cocktails have with alcohol. And alcohol, as we all know, is a kind of intoxicating substance that lowers your inhibitions. This isn't the only time the game makes this kind of parallel with blood and alcohol either. Just looking back at some of the descriptions of the items we've picked up so far can help illustrate that. On the blood vial itself, once a patient has had their blood ministered, a unique but common treatment in Yarnum, successive infusions recall the first and are all the more invigorating for it. And while I didn't touch on this before, invigorating is working in two ways here. It both heals you and gives you a special feeling. This kind of language is highly reminiscent of an addictive drug. Every time you take another hit of blood, it recalls the feeling you had when you took that first infusion. Also, think back to Yosefka's blood vial, where it says, "This refined blood, highly invigorating, restores a larger amount of HP." So keep that in mind as I talk to this NPC.
You're a hunter, aren't you? Then, well, do you know of any safe places? I've heard I have. Shutting up indoors isn't always enough. Well, if you hunters got off your arses, you wouldn't be in this mess. You're obligated to help me, you hear? So what'll it be? Are you going to tell me you're not? Yeah, I should have known. You're good for nothing. No respect for the elderly is what that is. That little good you outsiders do. Go on, admit it. You think we're all mad, don't you? Well, go and stop it. I know all your tricks.
So there we have yet another well-handled and atmospheric translation. But let me get back to the point I was making before. What Yosefka's blood vial shows us, among other things, is that refined blood is even more highly invigorating than regular blood is. This seems like another pretty strong drug parallel to me. Finally, we have the last line in the pungent blood cocktail. In Yarnum, they produce more blood than alcohol, as the former is the more intoxicating. What I think is going on here is that the game is using a substance whose effects you're fully aware of, alcohol, and possibly other drugs as well, and then saying that this blood is even more potent. Then you get this item that's a mix of both alcohol and blood, and you're told that its pungent smell attracts bloodthirsty beasts. We'll see more examples of this as the game goes on, but it seems to draw a parallel between loss of control, reveling in euphoric feeling, and beasthood. I think it's no accident that the game portrays hunters as having highly strong forces of will. But to touch one last time on the translation of the pungent blood cocktail description, the literal translation of the final line of the English version is somewhat different from the Japanese. A more direct translation might be, alcohol doesn't suit Yarnum, better to get drunk on blood. Compare that to, in Yarnum they produce more blood than alcohol, as the former is the more intoxicating. This is an interesting choice, but ultimately I think a good one. Now for dialogue.
Oh, a hunter, are you? And an outsider? What a mess you've been caught up in. And tonight of all nights. Here, to welcome the new hunter. Prepare yourself for the worst. There are no humans left. They're all flesh-hungry beasts now. Still lingering about. What's wrong? A hunter unnerved by a few beasts. No matter. Without fear in our hearts, we're little different from the beasts themselves. What are you still doing here? Enough trembling in your boots. A hunter must hunt.
It's always been interesting to me that she tells you basically with those last two dialogues that you need the right amount of fear. Without it, you're a little different than a beast, but you can't let it stop you because a hunter must hunt. As for the translation of her dialogue, generally I think it's really solid, and there's one line in particular that I'd like to mention. Partway through the first of her dialogue, she has a line where the subtitles in Japanese say, "Shikkari surundayo." Literally, this would translate to something like, "Keep yourself together." Or you might translate it to something along the lines of, "Hang in there." It's a phrase that you can run across a lot in Japanese, and it can be a challenge to come up with a natural-sounding translation for it. So what was that line in the English? Prepare yourself for the worst. I think that's perfect. But let's check out our new weapon, Saw Spear, one of the trick weapons of the workshop, commonly used by those who dedicate themselves to the hunt. This saw, effective at drawing the blood of beasts, transforms into a medium-range spear. The saw, with its set of bloodletting teeth, has become a symbol of the hunt, and only grows in effectiveness the more grotesquely transformed the beast. So, interestingly enough, the first line here is the same as the other weapons we've picked up so far, and once again we're seeing a slight variation in English. The last set of lines, on the other hand, is repeated information in both languages. That having been said, probably the most interesting translation choice here involves the middle two lines. A literal translation might be, functions both as a saw that shreds the skin of beasts before transformation, and a spear that allows for combat from a distance after transformation. Contrast that with, this saw, effective at drawing the blood of beasts, transforms into a medium-range spear. So there are some pretty big differences there, but I think this is an effective way at rewording things to get across the same essential information. In both cases, we know that we have a saw that draws the blood of beasts that transforms into a longer-range weapon. And the official translation does this with 60 characters less than my literal translation. But let's look at the throwing knife. Throwing knife. Throwing knife with a finely serrated blade, one of the old hunter Henrik's favorite weapons. Does not cause a great deal of damage to beasts, but with deft use can distract attackers and keep them at bay. So I think this is another well-done translation without too much to talk about. This next one's worth discussing though. Madman's knowledge. Skull of madman touched by the wisdom of the great ones. Used to gain insight. Making contact with eldritch wisdom is a blessing, for even if it drives one mad, it allows one to serve a grander purpose for posterity. So there are a number of notable things to talk about here. First, the item name in Japanese uses an unusual set of characters. And the characters I'm referring to are specifically for the word that's being translated as knowledge. In Japanese, that word is chie. And as far as I know, there are two different sets of characters that can be used to represent it. The first of them looks like this. When written this way, the word pretty much just means knowledge or understanding. But there's another set of characters you can use to write out this word. This here is also pronounced chie. It also has a slightly different nuance to it. This latter representation is a term that comes from Buddhism. It refers to the process of shedding your earthly desires and devoting yourself to enlightenment. With this kind of chie, you can see through to the truth of things. And of course it's this latter, more unusual representation that's being used by the game. It really enhances the idea that whoever had this madman's knowledge to begin with encountered a kind of knowledge of the way things really are that they couldn't handle. Then we come along and dig this insight out of their dead skull. An interesting way of obtaining knowledge, to say the least. This brings me to my next point, though, which is the translation of the word insight itself. In Japanese, the term that's being used is keimo. It's a term that's often translated as enlightenment. But at least as far as I know, this term is not to be understood in the sense of Buddhist or religious enlightenment. For example, the Japanese term for Enlightenment philosophy or the Enlightenment period in history uses this term. The stress is on rational knowledge and thinking scientifically. It also carries a sense of instruction. There's a sense in which, at least for the term keimo, one has to be being instructed by someone or something greater than oneself. An example that I ran across when looking for examples of the kind of nuance this term has in Japanese is that at least with the term keimo, students can be enlightened by their teacher, but the teacher cannot be enlightened by the students, unless it's a really bad teacher. Now, I bring all this up because these are nuances that I think it's interesting to look at as we continue to go through the game. But now let's consider the English translation. The official term here is insight. And I think there are some really interesting things going on with this choice. Because while insight doesn't necessarily get across the sense of rationality and enlightenment the way keimo does, it does a great job at getting at the idea of understanding the world the way it is, which is something that gets back to the ideas behind the word chie, or knowledge, that I brought up before. It's also a term that allows the game to make something of a pun that's only really applicable in the situation that's at hand in Bloodborne. I am of course referring to the idea of sight on the inside, which is something that we'll encounter more as we continue to play the game. And you also have to consider how these terms would sound as a stat. I think it's a lot more natural to talk about encountering a situation that gives you 1 point of insight as opposed to encountering a situation that gives you 1 point of enlightenment. So in the end, I think that insight is a great translation on its own and is employed to really good effect in the item description for Madman's Knowledge. And I think this is a really good example of how thinking of the game as a whole, considering its themes and its mechanics and the story that it's telling, is an important part of crafting a truly inspired translation. It's also an example of working with information that can be easily presented in one language that can be a challenge or impossible to represent in another language. In the Japanese, when they want to evoke a particular usage of the word chie, they can make that clear with a visual depiction. That's something that you can't do in English. On the other hand, you have things like keimo, where in English you have the pun of insight, which can fill in for the idea of rationality. But now for our last item description. Oil urn. When this urn hits its mark, the target is drenched in oil and made extremely flammable. Fire is commonplace on the hunt, and oil urns accentuate its effect. Sometimes, when hunters burn beasts, they appear intoxicated by the euphoria of purification. This, I think, is an excellent translation, and most notable is the final line. Literally, it might translate to something like, hunters, who burn beasts, perhaps get drunk on the excitement of purification. Compare that to, sometimes, when hunters burn beasts, they appear intoxicated by the euphoria of purification. Let me just say that last part one more time. Intoxicated by the euphoria of purification. I absolutely love that phrasing. Of course, there is a slight shift here. The Japanese is speculating about the internal state of all hunters. Again, it's something like, perhaps hunters, who burn beasts, get drunk on the excitement of purification. The English, on the other hand, makes a statement about the external appearance of hunters that's indicative of their internal state. Sometimes when hunters burn beasts, they appear intoxicated by the euphoria of purification. I actually think this is more interesting in English because it implicates you more strongly. But that's about all the time I have for today. Thank you all for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for me, I would love to hear them, and I hope to see you next time.